Thank you, everyone, for coming this evening. Thank you very much to the Boston Society of Architects and the Rhodes Trustees for awarding me this scholarship. It was truly an incredible experience. And I would also like to thank many of my friends who've helped me along the way, both during my trip and when I got back making this book. It's incredibly helpful, and I couldn't have done it without you. So when I was awarded this scholarship, I was faced with the task of selecting a topic. I could pick anything, really, and anywhere I wanted to go. And so I needed to pick something that could sustain a lengthy study, as well as flexible enough to adapt to any complications that might arise along the trip. So I looked towards my thesis project, actually, at Syracuse University, which looked at government center. So this project, in a sense, became an extension of that. And at the core of this investigation are really these two images. And how could these two images literally, or these two places rather, literally across the street from each other exist simultaneously? How could some place be so good and the other place so bad? What makes City Hall so terrible? And there have been seemingly countless proposals for this area, and yet we're still faced with the unfortunate reality. And so my task was to visit as many civic spaces outside the United States as I could, documenting everything from context, scale, program, and circulation of various civic centers, and resulting in a virtual encyclopedia of spaces that I could then apply to Boston's government center. But most importantly, I didn't want this to be a historic look of the places we already know. I wanted it to be a contemporary look of how these places really operate in a contemporary society. So I chose Western Europe, as they mentioned at the beginning here. And not only does the architecture and urban language of this continent most closely resemble that of the United States, but it allowed me the opportunity to explore a very wide variety of cities and cultures within a very manageable area. So this way I was really able to extend the budget that I was given and see as many places as I could. And so in this illustration here, the ones with the red, everything is listed on the right, but everything with the red dots are the places where I actually selected a square to study. And in those places, I would stay for 2 to 3 weeks and complete a series of drawings and analysis of the particular square, which is also listed up there. The other cities were more of an architecture tour. Along the way, they were short stays, one or 2 days. For instance, a little Corbusier pilgrimage that I went on, I was able to actually stay in a couple of the projects, which was really great. But a year ago today, I was actually still on my trip. It was day 222 out of 303 days. And this was really the beauty of the project, was that it brought me to the places that I really wanted to be in anyways. But before we really get into it, I'll just go quickly over the process of when I arrived in a city. And I'll take, for an example here, Venice, Italy, and the Piazza San Marco, which many of us probably know very well. This drawing is kind of representing the kind of blank slate that I was given when I arrived in a city, and how I filled in that information I'll describe. So I started with the city itself, understanding the larger context of at least the urban core of the city. Then I would develop a drawing that is more diagrammatic. It highlights the important routes to the city, the important spaces, and really I wanted to locate the Piazza San Marco within the larger context of the city. How does this fit into the larger city? And so then after doing that, and I didn't just use the aerial photo, I actually walked everywhere to complete these. So then I would move to the next step, actually select the square and start with an aerial photograph, much like with the city. And then I would actually take that and just quickly sketch out in a sketchbook basic outlines. And then I would actually take that to the square itself and paste measurements off, marking everything from the paving patterns to the benches to the program that surrounds it, really everything that I could think of. I try to get it all in one drawing. And then I would create a more complete AutoCAD drawing that then I could manipulate the scale. I have everything at the same scale. And yeah, so this is typical what it would look like. The red grid is pointing north, and it's a 50-meter interval, and they're the same grid over every plan, so we can start to see scale when we look at it. But beyond just the two-dimensional drawing was developing the three-dimensional analysis, understanding what this square actually looked like, and beyond just what the square looked like, start to take it apart and analyze its components, its relationships, how it's really working. And then lastly, I would complete these two drawings, and the one on the left is the ground level program. And again, this is getting at the contemporary uses of these spaces. What is making up these spaces today? And largely it's a lot of commercial and cafe, but of course there's the civic components, whether it's the churches or the city halls, et cetera. And lastly was the image on the right, which is a circulation diagram, which was really a culmination of 2 weeks coming and going from the site and observing people's movements. And so in this one, for instance, you see most people will stay towards the north because that's where all or towards the top near the church, that's where all the tourist attractions are, but then diagonally through the space. So why are people moving diagonally? And that gets back to the larger context because there's a pedestrian route that runs through the city. So all these things kind of working together. So later we'll get more into the kind of total body of work and how it can apply to Government Center. But first, I think it's important to really understand what the value of public space is. And it's commonly defined as a space that is accessible to all citizens for their use and enjoyment. And its lure and significance is not lost upon architects such as Robert Venturi, who points out, quote, that architects have been bewitched by a single element in the Italian landscape, the piazza. The buildings surrounding the square are often thought of as facing the square, creating a focal point of distinction within the larger urban context. Cities indeed need public space, yet it is not the public space, but rather the publicness of the space that is of the utmost importance. In the environment of the square itself, this urban theater has always been something much more worthwhile. A manifestation of the relationship between people and the city, its value can be assimilated to that of a painting where the canvas's lines and colors are the ingredients, but its beauty, harmony, grace, and simplicity are its values. The public square, therefore, is not a value in itself, but it has values. It is valuable, in fact. So if the world is to contain public spaces, Hannah Arendt suggests that they cannot be erected for one generation and planned for the living only. They must transcend the life of mortal men. The public spaces today, for instance, are much different than those in ancient Rome. There are, of course, similarities that transcend generations, but we also must consider the changes that occur and the solutions that adapt to the kinds of places that exist in today's contemporary world. The Egyptians and Mesopotamians were the first to understand its value and significance of its civic spaces as ceremonial centers that, by developing monumental blocks characterized by temples and funerary complexes. The main flaw, however, with this type of architecture is that it tended to be less concerned with space and more concerned with mass, resulting in a lifeless part of the city. It was not until the development of democracy that the Civic Center was transformed to a space for the people at the Greek Agora and later Roman Forum. For the first time, government had a vested interest in the well-being of its citizens by creating a place where both parties had the opportunity to participate alongside each other in a collective membership, which was much more faithful and enduring than their own personal view. So lively civic centers, they showcase the strength of community and help kindle a democratic spirit. Although people no longer live where they work or even shop where they live, the public realm still holds significant relevance. When successful, these spaces not only enrich the lives of those who use them, but also attract investment and incite economic growth and even make adjacent neighborhoods more desirable. Most importantly, it can be the architectural expression of the people, where it provides a place for citizens to see themselves speak and act in public. Contemporary United States cities, however, like Boston, have lost the basic meaning and fundamental importance of the center as the very heart of the city. Unfortunately, more often than not, today's cities are left with cold, lifeless spaces and squandered economic opportunity. People in general are clear enough about the ugliness of these places, whether it's the cleanliness, the heat, the congestion, the chaos, and so on. However, they are hardly aware of the potential value a more harmonious surrounding, an environment that they may have only seen through the eyes of a tourist. People ought not to accept the unfortunate situations left by previous generations. They must instead seek ways of improving these places in their cities, for there is much greater interest at stake than simply themselves. So as I mentioned, the Greeks and the Romans, they provide us with the fundamental tools in which to create successful contemporary civic centers. As it once did for these civilizations, the Civic Center should once again stand for the symbol of our cities, the center of activity in which every citizen has the right to participate and enjoy its freedom. It is in fact the stage that legitimizes what representatives do and keeps government in check. They anchor our downtowns and communities, projecting a flickering flame that illuminates our cities. In a limited sense, the European city can be seen as a continuation of the Roman one, particularly in its arrangement of its fortification walls, primary roadways, and central public squares, most of which can still be traced in the cities today, in the city fabric. Despite retaining many of these traits spatially or even politically or economically, the modern city has evolved in its own unique manner. So why then do we settle for lackluster spaces when we are so often confronted with in our cities? Perhaps it's somewhat economically driven. However, this cannot and must not stand as an excuse when there is so much more at stake for our cities and society. The architecture of the public institutions can also have a profound influence on the public spaces. The role of civic institutions should extend beyond the building itself. Not only should it function as an active place of community, but also participate and engage with adjacent public spaces, thus creating civic space. And the success of these spaces are numerous and beneficial. However, when these places fail, the public is less connected with not only with each other, but with the places in which they live as well, resulting in an indifference or even hostility towards its civic institutions. When architecture is truly great, it has the ability to transform the public realm into something seductive. Former United States Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan once said that, quote, "Buildings should not make private citizens realize how unimportant they are, but instead should create an architecture of intimacy, one that brings people together in an experience of confidence and trust." The problem with planning for such buildings today is that they focus on the scale of the immediate community and not in terms of its meaning as part of the public life in the city as a whole. It is these network of public buildings and spaces that has always given the city a perceptive order, a sense of location for people within it, a much-needed hierarchy. Meneo's town hall in Logroño, Spain, is a fantastic example of this connective nature. However, often cities are left with the atomizing of spaces instead. And is this society of atomized spaces that creates an environment where people are cut off from one another. So the real problem in city planning today now lies on not what to do, but rather what to avoid. The skill of city planning is not foreign and has been in practice for millennia, many of times not with formally trained architects. The problem now is that planners seek to improve the quality of public life by making it more intimate. However, the very sense of humanity, the sense of humanity creates a very sterility that they should seek to avoid. Instead, we should seek to create spaces that are more inclusive without being so intimate, and resulting in a vibrant and engaging public realm. But the success of these public spaces within our cities are undeniably beneficial, whether it be socially or economically, etc. However, it is proven incapable of maintaining itself over time, at least in many US cities, and has in turn lost some of its value in the eyes of society. As Louis Kahn once said, quote, "The center is the cathedral of the city. It should not only be accessible, allowing equal expression and equal sense of belonging to all participants, but should also be socially relevant, transcendental, and concerned with everyday life matters of both the individual and the collective group. The public realm must be saved from its impending demise and reestablish itself as the heart at the center of our cities in which we gather and weave our society together." So now I'd like to talk a little bit about a lot of the great spaces that I was able to visit, and looking at some of the primary themes that I uncovered, and later we'll see how that can create a complete image with Boston. So first, I'd like to talk about scale, and that's probably the most tangible aspect of dealing with public spaces. And here I have the two largest spaces of the 26 that I visited along the trip. And they're both in Russia. The one on the left is St. Petersburg, in St. Petersburg, Palace Square, and on the right is Red Square in Moscow. And underneath the size, you see the average and median. And what that is saying is it's relating it to the 26 other squares. So Palace Square on the left is 484% larger than the median scale of all the squares that I visited. So these places are just huge. And just for point of comparison, this is the smallest one I visited in Barcelona, and it's tiny. And So here we have Palace Square, and it's huge space, and it's made up primarily of only three elements. There's at the very top of this image, there's the Winter Palace, which is now the State Hermitage Museum. At the bottom is the General Assembly Building, it's government offices, and at the center is a very large column. It's actually one of the largest in the world, over 47 meters tall, bigger than even Trajan's column in Rome. But Palace Square, it's certainly one of the most central squares in St. Petersburg. It connects, and most important squares in St. Petersburg. And actually, it was once considered the center of the Russian Empire when that was the capital. But it connects two very important things, Nevsky Prospect, which is equivalent to maybe Fifth Avenue in New York, with the Palace Bridge, which is maybe like the Brooklyn Bridge, if we want to think in American terms. So it's a very important part of the city, and many important events occurred here. In 1905 was Bloody Sunday, and in 1917 was the October Revolution. So very important pieces of the city's history happened at this location. But the most celebrated component of this square is really the northwest boundary of the square, and that's the Hermitage Museum, which you see here in this image. And it's really a stunning building. It's 17th century Rococo style. It's very ornate, and it's huge. It goes along with the hugeness of the square. It's over 22,000 square meters of the museum, which exists today. So now let's talk about how this space is organized. And as you can see here, at the top right, you have the Hermitage Museum. At the bottom, the curvy piece is the General Assembly Building, and that huge column is just this little piece in the middle. And next to the square is the Alexander Gardens, which is where the Nevsky Prospect Street, as well as two other streets, collide. It's this main park, much like the Piazza del Popolo in Rome, except opposite. Instead of going out, it's coming in. But next to it is this square, this park. And the park leads right into the square, and you would think that that would be a great thing to have this dialogue between the two, but there's 7 or 9 lanes of traffic that separate these two things. And it looks very small in this image, but that's just because of this, the square is so huge. So it all but cuts off any kind of connection between the two. And so the result of this is just this massively expansive space that you just get totally lost in. Any sense of orientation is completely lost. If you can hardly pick out the people in here. In the very center of the image, the white, that's actually a person, so you feel quite lost in the square. On the other hand, there's Red Square in Moscow, which is comparable scale, but as we'll see, its organization creates a much different outcome. It's so big it actually takes up 2 slides here. But Red Square, it's certainly the most famous square in Moscow, and arguably the entire world. Centrally located, all roads radiate from this point. The name Red Square is often confused with it's confused with the link between communism and the color red, however, or even the color of the red bricks of the Kremlin, which is the government complex on the left side of this image. But actually, the name is derived from the Russian word krasnaya, probably butchering that, but what it means is red or beautiful, so it really has nothing to do with communism. It's just this beautiful square. But the development of this square dates back to the end of the 15th century when the Kremlin, the government complex, was nearing its completion. On the other 2 sides are rivers, which served for its protection, but it was vulnerable from a military point of view. So the square actually developed from tearing down a big chunk of the city, 234 meters from the edge of the wall for defensive purposes. So it was originally a moat before it became a market, and eventually became Red Square as we know it in the late 1600s. And so similar to Palace Square, it's a huge space, but as we see, it's a linear space. So it's a lot different. You feel a connection with these two, the longer sides, which is where the Kremlin is and the big department store on the other side. And so capping the ends are these two kind of focal points. On the left, we have the Resurrection Gate, and on the right is St. Basil's Cathedral, which has become the image of Moscow and even Russia today. And it was actually almost torn down. It was saved by Stalin himself. because they were tearing things down to allow the military vehicles to drive through. But the sides is really where it's at. This is what makes this square so much different. And on this here, we're looking from the department store towards the Kremlin and the Lenin mausoleum there in the center. And then this is looking from that location back. And what you can tell from this here is that you don't feel as lost in this square. You can almost touch the other side. There's this the sense of enclosure, which is a lot better than in St. Petersburg. Sorry, and yeah, and this is actually a really expensive mall, probably the most expensive I've ever been in. So, but what we're really talking about here is sense of enclosure. What better place to look than the Piazza del Campo in Siena, Italy? And it's perhaps the most iconographic representation of civic space the world's ever seen. It's got the city hall here, and it's much different than many Italian piazzas, because this here is centered around kind of civic life and not religious life, which is very different than the norm in Italy. And so its memorable fishbone brick pattern, as we see today, is broken up into 10 distinctive radiating lines, separating the square into 9 segments, which represents the Council of the Nine, which ruled over Siena during its most prosperous period in its history. But the piazza itself remains a focal point today as civic and public life in Siena, is often referred to as the cradle of civic life due to its overall shape and gentle slope. And so here we see the shape. It's kind of like a shell, and it's sloping down from top left to bottom right here. But what's really interesting about this is there's actually 11 entrances in and out of this square, and it's not a particularly large square. It's not quite the smallest, but it's on the smaller end. But to have 11 entrances, it's huge. And I think Palace Square only had 4 or 5, Red Square only had 4 or 5, and they were huge. So this really makes a big difference. And here you look at these are actually all 11 pictures of them. And they range from streets to just simple passageways. And if you didn't really count them, you would never understand that there was 11. But this really makes it a center gathering point for the city. But more important than even these entrances is the main event that occurs at this place 2 times a year, and that's the Palio. I had the opportunity to go down and witness it for myself, and it was really great. But it's important for these. It's basically a horse race that goes around the piazza. They set up kind of a dirt path, bareback race against the different districts, and it's like in Boston if we were to set up a horse track at Government Center and then have the north end off against Back Bay, Beacon Hill, et cetera, and you all compete for some banner, basically bragging rights. But it's all Italian, so it's very chaotic, to say the least. But it's really important for these squares to have the ability of hosting a special event such as this, whether it's the Palio in Siena or it's the Red Sox winning a championship and celebrating in Government Center. But there's somewhat a delicate balance when it comes to scale. Too small and there's little presence or sense of importance, and too big and one might become disconnected with the surroundings and lose any sense of orientation or enclosure. The Piazza del Campo does a great job of doing both. And all this pageantry that goes on through the city for this very, very short but very exciting horse race. If you look close, the red blur is a person actually falling off his horse. He didn't finish. So more importantly, perhaps more important than this main event, this special event that occurs 1 or 2 times a year, is the everyday life aspect of the space. What happens to these spaces on the other 364 days? For this, we'll look at the the Campo dei Fiori in Rome, a space that many of us that have been to Rome have surely visited, one of the most popular spaces in Rome. The Campo dei Fiori literally translated means field of flowers, although its reference is obviously not associated with the current configuration of the space. It actually originates from the Middle Ages when it was a natural meadow. It wasn't until it was paved until the late 15th century, which has remained ever since. And one of the original uses was actually for capital punishment. And in 1600, the philosopher Giordano Bruno was burned alive, and there's a statue at the center commemorating this event. But today, the Campo dei Fiori is is changed dramatically and is home to Rome's everyday outdoor market. So taking a look at the ground level program of this space, we can see that the cafe and commercial components take up almost 88% of the total. It's huge. It's almost entirely commercial and/or cafe, which I guess is very typical of the Italian squares. But overall, the success of the piazza is not only a result of this program that's distributed along its perimeter, it's in fact what occurs at the center, and that's the market. And so in the morning, it's an empty square, and slowly the vendors start to come in, they set up their tents, they bring in the food, and people start to use it. And at this point in the early hours, it's largely an older crowd, the older Italian women. And that's what's great about this square, as touristy as it may be, it's still very local neighborhood square where people really go and live. People really live there and use it. And so in the morning, it's largely the older crowd using it, and then in the afternoon they break everything down, and it's a huge mess. And you can sort of start to see around the perimeter here that it's starting to be used a little bit more. So as they're cleaning, the restaurants are starting to open, the shops are starting to open. And at this point, the crowd of people is becoming a little bit younger. The older crowd is now left. It's starting to become a little bit younger until at night, when the market is completely gone. It's like it was never there. If you didn't know that they held this market here, you'd never even know. They cleaned it up really, really great. But now it's clear the perimeter is really keeping the square going once the market's left. And it's even younger crowd now. And if I had another picture, even later in the night, we would see lots of young people hanging around the statue. And so this square, it changes not only programmatically throughout the day, through the course of the day, but also it's changing demographically. So it's this really kind of vibrant and exciting place. Like no matter what time of day you go, it's always a little bit different. And so another square that utilizes a market to its advantage is Market Square in Helsinki, Finland. As if the name isn't obvious enough, Market Square, it's a very prominent location in the city. It's right on the bay where ships come in. And at the very north, bounding the square, is the Helsinki City Hall, the Swedish Embassy, and the Presidential Palace. So some very important buildings that are up there. So, of course, like I said, it's one of the oldest and most important squares in the city. And goods were actually brought to port just adjacent to the square and alongside many of the very significant buildings. And the marketplace sells everything from finished souvenirs to food, and even contains small cafes located under the distinctive orange tents you can see in the background. Now, this is a little bit different than the one in Rome. It's a little bit more touristy, but it's still used by the locals. Maybe it was just because I was there and it was a little cold, but even still with the cold weather, it was still used. And the ships delivering the goods to the cities have since been replaced with various ferries and cruise terminals, which you can see in the distance back there. And a lot of the things along the shore ferry people along the Baltic Sea. However, sometimes you can still get the freshest fish sold directly from the boat stock nearby, which is really great. But as we see here, it's hard to imagine the space without its market. How could it be successful? This is the circulation diagram for this square, and I don't have a key, so the dotted lines are the automobiles. The ones that look like zippers towards the left, those are the trams, and the continuous lines, those are the people movement. So the people are obviously moving through the market, but then there's all this traffic, which has an effect on the square. So it's running along the face of all these important buildings. So beyond just the exclusively government program or anti-public program, like a non-accessible program at that end, there's this roadway and tramways that are completely separating the space from its context. So much it can't operate like the one in Rome did, which really allowed, the one in Rome was allowed to change throughout the day. This one, when the market leaves, the space is dead. And if it wasn't for the market, you could even argue that this place would probably become something like a parking lot. But it's the infrastructure isn't all bad, and some places really embrace the transportation infrastructure and use it to their benefit. And for this, we'll take a quick look at Marienplatz, which is in Munich, Germany. And this square, this is the plan of it, obviously, but Note the 6 stairways, or they're the kind of the dark blurs. Sorry for the resolution, but those stairways are going to be an important part, as we'll see, and there's 6 of them. And so, Marienplatz has been a central space in Munich since as early as the mid-12th century. So it's very old, and the square is actually named after the Mary's column, which sits at the middle, and was erected at the center of the square to celebrate the end of the Swedish occupation during the 30 Years' War. So, but today the column literally marks the geographic center of the city. So all road distances in Munich are actually measured from this point. So this square is literally the center of Munich. But in addition to being the geographic center, it's also home to the local government. As we can see here, this building spanning the entire northern edge of the square is the new City Hall, and it's incredibly Gothic style. It stretches over 300 feet across, and there's actually a spire that is chopped off here, but goes up over 260 feet. It's huge and impressive. And the Glockenspiel is probably the biggest tourist disappointment in Europe. But getting back to where this square sits in the relative context of the city, I thought it would be better to look at this square in terms of the metro map in this city instead of the actual city fabric. Because if you can look right here, this is Marienplatz. And so it literally, almost every transportation line intersects at this square, which helps the square look like this. It's constantly feeding people to the square. And what's important about that is the square, it doesn't become just a dot on this, on the metro map. It becomes an image in people's minds. It's really a marker, an orientation point in the city. You understand what the space is and where it is in the city once you get off the subway. And what was really interesting about this square in particular is, of course, you can see here tons of people and activity is very, very popular. But if you were to take off the ground plane of this square and look on what's underneath, there's actually a whole another square, which is all of the entrances to all the different lines that run through there, train and subway. There's commercial program down there. There's tons of things happening down below. And so it's like almost these 2 squares happening at the same time. And so another square that is starting to embrace this modern infrastructure is the Puerta del Sol in Madrid, Spain. And I was there. It was actually really interesting because it was under construction when I was there, so I was able to see the square for what it was and also what it was going to be potentially. And so the really bad black dot is the construction zone. So the whole middle was kind of under construction at this point. And so originally this was one of the gates of the city, and that's where the name, the Puerta del Sol, translated means gate of the sun. And so this is also the center of Madrid, right outside on the left here, the very left of the image, the very right of the image. There's a marker on the ground that's kilometer 0. It's, again, same as Marienplatz, it's literally marking the center of Madrid. And so here, just like the last one, there's the circulation diagram. As we could see in this one, everyone's kind of towards the top and the bottom, and that's because of that construction that's happening throughout the center. And most of it's limited to beneath the square, though. And so this here is what it used to be. The red arrows are the roadways that existed. And what happened is it really broke up the space. And as I talked about earlier, this atomizing of spaces, it's really difficult to use. It's not a very popular space. No one uses it because they can't. It's hard to get across the roadways with all the traffic. So what they did is they took away most of the roadways. I mean, they had to leave some of them, of course. You need roads in cities. But what they did is they opened up this northern part where all those people are, because those 3 openings in the city fabric are actually 3 pedestrian streets that are running up. And then at the end of these streets in the square itself, there's the metro stop and a lot of other restaurants and stuff like that. So the square is a much more singular space now. People can actually use it. But what's really interesting about this square is that underneath the square is the subway, like in Munich. But even still, the construction that they're doing is even below that, is they're bringing in the regional rail network underneath the subway. So you could arrive from Barcelona straight to the literal center of Madrid and not have to do any transfers. So this square, again, is becoming is part of the city. It's orienting people in the city in a much better way. It's really embracing this modern technology. But not all the time is the infrastructure that good. I mean, it can be a very challenging thing to deal with, as we'll see with the City Hall Square in Copenhagen, Denmark. And as if you can't tell by now, I mean, there's so much traffic around this square. It's incredible. And there's certainly it's still a very popular square, but the primary focal point is, of course, the City Hall, which here you can see in red. And it actually went through a bunch of iterations before only recently being completed at the turn of the 20th century. So it's a relatively new square for a city. And so as we see from the circulation diagram, there's certainly a lot of activity and vibrancy that's happening in this square. And virtually every type of transportation intersects at this point, vehicular, bus, subway, and pedestrian. Although the buses are dealt with in a rather effective manner. They're pushed all the way to the left with the dotted lines, and they're separated by a small structure, which is the entrance to the subway. But the roadways really are a problem because, as you can see, people want to move north-south in the square because they want to go from the pedestrian corridor through the city center, and then to the south is where the main train station is. So people are constantly going back and forth, but there's all these roadways that completely cut you off, and it's a huge problem because it takes most people 2 tries just to get from the edge to the square, and then once you're there, you're very disconnected from the perimeter. So it doesn't really work all that well. So if the analysis of these spaces begins with the differentiation of the data into categories, it must end with the reintegration into a complete image. And City Hall Plaza at Government Center in Boston is one of the best examples of an unsuccessful civic center, leaving a scar of an expansive and bleak space where it should otherwise be paramount. The application of these lessons could prove to see a benefit to Boston's civic realm. And so first, a little bit of history, if some of you don't know. Cities actually, its complex social history is matched only by its geographic transformations. And the very landscape of Boston has been altered tremendously throughout the past 4 centuries. And its landmass has actually tripled in size since its inception in 1630. In fact, many of the creations in the city this actually might be considered one of the greatest American engineering feats. And such tinkering with Boston's cityscape is in what in many ways characterizes the city, and it has characterized the city since its early beginnings. And most of the buildings that constitute the city today actually sit upon reclaimed land, as you can see, Back Bay and the South End. But many of the city's original landmarks that once distinguished its topography have been irrevocably altered or even lost forever. And so brings us to kind of Scollay Square. So Scollay Square was Boston's real first social center in which the city grew around in the 17th century. Given its central location in the city, it's naturally a place of great significance and wealth, demonstrated by many of the institutions and people that resided here at its location. And some of the more noteworthy institutions were the courthouse, Faneuil Hall, as well as the old Boston City Hall, which no longer exists. But during the 19th century, Scollay Square would see great change both in its physical makeup and perhaps more drastically in its social breakdown. The introduction of the public transportation system had a great effect on the transportation of this area. And it allowed those who could not normally afford to get around the city to do so much more easily. And so this in tandem with the tremendous influx of immigrants at the time, all but forced out the upper class and established Scollay Square as the true melting pot for the city of Boston. Much of the upper class and wealthy had taken up residence in nearby Beacon Hill, which even to this day remains, as we all know, the kind of more sought after and expensive neighborhoods in the whole city. But by the end of the 19th century, Scollay Square had completely transformed from a center of civic and aristocratic life to a congested commercial center and entertainment hub filled with just about everything. It's just, say, very entertaining, to say the least. And so, in the early 1960s, an urban renewal master plan was developed by architect I.M. Pei in the area of Scollay Square in order to consolidate federal, state, and city offices. And the idea was to enhance or to reestablish Boston's sluggish economic and political influence at the national scale, in which, to some extent, it's actually true. It really did help put Boston back on the map. But the 90-acre site around Scollay Square, it was completely demolished, and it was chosen for its sort of rundown and lewd nature. And the plan included the restoration of some historic buildings, but primarily building government offices. And the master plan has remained a vital force in the shaping of Government Center for more than 50 years, even to today, virtually without exception. All of the public and private projects executed have been followed almost to the T, not to, exactly by plan. And so here, this is Scollay Square as existed in 1928. And just to orient you, this here is the Faneuil Hall, and here these three are Quincy Market, and Scollay Square was this area here. And so what happened is they tore it all down and they built Government Center. And as a result, the space surrounding Boston City Hall is one of the most disappointing places in America, not just because it failed so utterly, but because it has been a failure for so long. Boston is a great city, and its desolate place has been its center point for more than 50 years. Everything about City Hall Plaza and its surrounding Government Center is all wrong, which is truly a shame. Bleak, expansive, and shapeless. Square is an exceedingly poor image of the city where image should be paramount. It conveys nothing in the way of information about Boston, its history, or even its sense of place. The buildings around it are uninteresting and devoid of activity, and the streets around it too wide, all of which contributes to a lack of access, despite the 5 subway stops in the area. There are no vistas here, no natural connections, even to Faneuil Hall just across the street are almost discouraged. When it comes to the activity and uses, one might find it hard to find a worse place in the city. But is it possible that City Hall Plaza could be redesigned and given a management plan to work? Some argue that the best solution for fixing this place is the most drastic. Take down the buildings, tear up the plaza, and do it all over again. And this here, this diagram is showing kind of both things at the same time. Scollay Square is that era, the 1920s, is in the dotted lines, and the solid objects are the buildings that exist today. And you can see the modern roadways and how many roadways that they actually took out. And after all, wonderful neighborhoods were demolished in the 50s due to this, and awful places were demolished in the 50s and 60s to create awful places such as this under urban renewal. So maybe a new kind of urban renewal could signal the end of bad places as centerpieces for our cities. The question we are faced with today then is how can we do no harm in city design? And as Richard Sennett points out, that the Hippocratic oath that all doctors take to do no harm has a sort of parallel in the world of urban design and may help shed some light on the problems we are faced with today. The oath itself is not a negative formulation. It inspires the doctor to look closely at the conditions of well-being. One is likely to treat the patient better if they investigate the finer grain of their condition rather than generalize about the illness. It could be a wonderful guide in thinking about how we as architects could take a similar Hippocratic oath in designing cities to do no harm and avoid many of the unfortunate situations we are left with today. Better yet, if we were required to take such an oath, would places like Government Center ever exist? And there have been countless proposals and competitions, et cetera, for City Hall. And one of the problems I have with it is that they really focus on the building and on the larger context. And this one in particular was an entry to the Shift Boston competition recently. And this actually, it's focusing on the building itself, but really it's about the larger picture. It's talking about perception. And if, for instance, all the celebrities started wearing diamond-encrusted city halls around their necks, what would our perception of City Hall be? And what I'm saying is, what if we were to change the larger context of Government Center? What if we were to change City Hall Plaza? How would that change our perception of City Hall? And I bet it would change it for the better, because it really is a great building in its own right. And, but London, in many ways, suffered from a similar condition than Boston, not by means of any large urban renewal project in terms of an unfriendly site dominated by pavement and cars, despite the grandeur of the buildings and historical significance. In particular, this is the area between Trafalgar Square and the Houses of Parliament. And this here is a photograph of a model of what Trafalgar Square used to be. And we'll come back to this. But London can serve as a fantastic example when considering a new Government Center in Boston. Not only and the more immediate scale of City Hall Plaza itself, but more importantly, through the larger contextual issues that it raises. And the World Squares for All initiative in London, it was undertaken by the likes of Norman Foster and Ricky Burdett, et cetera, a lot of very important people in the City of London. And what they decided is that the public realm is important for our cities and something needs to be done about it. So what they did is they looked at this area here and they called the World Squares for All initiative. And it's far more than simply another pedestrian project. It is instead a plan, or more importantly, an example for other cities dealing with similar issues to follow, which integrates a broad range of needs and users in order to sustain today's modern urban environment. So Trafalgar Square, this is what it looks like today, was actually the first phase of the project, and all this too is part of the whole Olympic effort, and even out to the congestion tax where people are driving in the city. It has to do with the public realm. But here we're going to look at Trafalgar Square, and here we can see a plan of what it looks like. And so just very basic here, we have the National Gallery at the top and the square in the middle. And the real problem with this space is that there's so much traffic around it, no one used the space. Everyone would avoid it, it was filled with pigeons. And there's this huge opportunity to connect with this very important civic institution, the National Gallery. And so it creates this island. This roadway is the main problem with the space. It severs any kind of connection with the institution. So what they did is they removed that roadway, reduced the traffic along the sides, and rerouted the traffic on the bottom. And the bottom, it still is sort of a problem, and it's a big city. It's tough dealing with the traffic. But to much extent, they did a really good job, because this here is what used to be a very busy roadway with those distinctive red buses and these crazy traffic. Now it's this place for artists, people to gather before or after they come and go from the museum. And this is the new connection from that street and National Gallery to the main square, and it's a hugely popular space. People sit there to look out and to really get to the space. And so, don't take it from me. It's a real success story in the City of London. And these figures here are developed by Space Syntax, which is a company, I believe they're London-based, that look at public spaces and are able to analyze them somehow with some modern technologies, which obviously I couldn't use during my trip. But this here, the activity increased by more than 250%, movement by 13 times, through route from 1 to 9%, and the destination from 2 to 17. This is a huge difference in the square. And so it's a huge success story. So how can that translate to Boston? And so as we look at Government Center, it's strategically placed at the center of the city. In fact, more so than any other Boston district, it touches almost everything. And so there's this huge potential, whether it's connecting to Columbus Park or the waterfront, or the Quincy Market, or the downtown crossing, or the Hanover Street and the North End. There's a huge potential that exists. So by looking at the city this way, considering another site for City Hall seems almost senseless. It's such a perfect location for City Hall and City Hall Plaza. And so this here is what the view from Hanover, the end of Hanover Street in the North End, very popular street, and this is the connection that you get to City Hall Plaza. It's beautiful. But some argue that, yeah, it was worse at one point. You had the expressway running through it, but I mean, this is not that much better. It's still a huge scar. I mean, some call it the green scar that's running through this area. And it's really a barrier between adjacent neighborhoods in City Hall Plaza. But what if it was different? What if the connection was a destination in itself? So here we're taking the Galleria in Milan and putting it in Boston. How does that change our use? How does that alter our use of the square? I mean, this would probably, you'd probably go out of your way to go through this space, to go through City Hall Plaza, whereas today you're seeking to avoid it. And so here we have all the squares that I visited as figures, and they're all to the same scale, so we can start to see some relationships that happen. And of course, we've already seen the ones on the right, Red Square and Palace Square. But on the bottom right, the red one, that's City Hall Plaza. So you could see how big it is compared to all these other squares. And so if we look at it in a graph form, you could see that it's almost as big as those Russian squares, just huge. And what I've done with this diagram is put the average and median across the middle, and assuming that that would be the ideal size to look at. So if I were to visit 100 more squares, that would start to become more precise and a target for City Hall. And so clearly the space is too big. And what you get is this bleak, depressing, empty square, and it's really not difficult to get a picture like this. It's almost always empty. But what if it was different? And this here is a greater sense of enclosure with the square. And how would that affect it? I think it would be much better, more density in the area. And so this is similar to the scale. Now we're graphing the ground level program that's surrounding these squares. And this is all 26 at the same time, and it's not really important to pick out which one is which at the moment. But these are all the categories that I saw through all the countries. And this here is doing the similar thing. It's marking the average and the median, and again saying like we should shoot for these ranges. And some of the better squares I visit, if you compare it to the average and median here, they fall right along those lines. So it starts to be some truth to that. But now if we graph City Hall Plaza to the average and median of all these squares, you could see there's something wrong here. There's a little too much government and not enough of the other stuff that people want to do. And oddly enough, the amount of government program is very similar to the Russian spaces. So it's almost like we have this communist square in Boston. So we need to raise the public stuff, the commercial, the cultural, the cafes, raise that up and reduce the government. Like, there still needs to be a government presence here. As you could see, it's not like government is zero. There's still a presence, but it can't be exclusively that. And so one of the more successful strategies for creating a vibrant and active space is, of course, the open market, as I mentioned earlier. It's a truly successful market has the ability to become a catalyst for the entire district and create a place where people want to go to. By their very nature, they attract a very diverse group of people and activity and enhance the entire area almost instantaneously. They can bolster local economies and renew downtown areas and even neighborhoods. It would be hard to imagine Market Square in Helsinki or even the Campo dei Fiori in Rome without their corresponding markets. They do not only define the image of these places, they make their existence possible. So here again we have Government Center and the boundary where the roadway is. And occasionally they have a small market here. But in general, this is what it looks like. But what if relocating Haymarket to Boston from its current awkward and crowded location to a more prominent and celebrated place at City Hall Plaza? This could potentially instantly transform the space from a bleak and dismal space to a much more vibrant and popular area for the city. If this, in addition to the market, we're coupled with the ground level program enhancement, much like in Rome, I mean, it could instantly improve the space, and it'd be a huge benefit, not only changing the square programmatically throughout the day, but demographically as well, and really trying to be a lot of things at the same time. And so, just to conclude here, we have a quote from, again, Richard Sennett. But City Hall Plaza can and must be saved from its disaster and reestablish itself as the symbolic and intrinsic heart of Boston, one which gathers and weaves its society together. Throughout its history, Boston is continually rebuilding and reinventing itself. Doing so, it's part of its DNA. As we saw with the founding of the city, whether it's changing the entire geographic landscape of the city, or if it's tearing down Scollay Square to build the government center, or it's tearing down a part to put the expressway, to re-tear it down again to put the greenway in. It's part of the city's history, so why not make City Hall Plaza part of that history? However, in order to accomplish this today, it would take drastic action, and drastic action must be taken. Drastic action like that of the 1960s urban renewal, but instead of creating the cold and lifeless spaces we are faced with today, this action would create a place that allows an equal sense of belonging to all its participants. It would be socially relevant, transcendental, and concerned with everyday life and matters of both the individual as well, and perhaps more importantly, the collective group of the city. So with that, I'd like to finish, and I just recently completed my book, if you liked what you heard tonight, you can purchase it on these 2 websites. But thank you very much.
Thanks, Josh. Well, if there are questions, I'm sure Josh would be happy to spend a little time answering any inquiries you have.
Are you familiar with the work that Friends of City Hall Plaza did a couple years ago when they tried to reinvigorate City Hall or City Hall Plaza?
With what? Sorry, I missed the beginning.
There's a group called Friends of City Hall Plaza. I think that was what they
Yeah.
maybe 10 years ago. Are you familiar with what they've done and how does that compare with your observation?
A little bit. I can't remember any of the specifics, but in general, a lot of the competitions and investigations into Government Center is really focused on the square itself. And what I'm saying is there's much more to it than just that space. Granted, it's a very big space and there's a lot to do in it, but it's how that space is relating to the larger context of the city, how that square can affect Back Bay, very far away in the city. And so that's kind of my take on the current competitions and investigations that happen there.
If you evaluate successful squares on the basis of form and use, where do you come down on the spectrum? Are successful squares beneficiaries of good form and good use, and good use correct or make viable a bad form, and vice versa?
I think the latter part of that is true. I think you could make a bad form more successful, but I think it's really it needs to be an interdisciplinary thing. It can't be just a bunch of architects looking, or a bunch of politicians looking, or a bunch of sociologists looking. It's got to be a real integration of everything. And from what I saw, like you could have some of the more successful spaces were better in all aspects. So I don't think I could pick just. If I can't say definitively it's about form or it's about use. It's really about everything working together as one unit.
I guess the question that a lot of these competitions are, what's the first step from the center into that environment? And I don't know if you have any final recommendations, or maybe that's why we need to buy the book, but where do we start?
I mean, it's really complicated today because everything is so political, and it's really hard to get anything done. Back in the 60s, the urban renewal, it was so easy that people were just handed money to do anything they wanted, and now it's quite the opposite. You need to really have to argue strongly for anything, even minor, to happen. I think that it needs to be a holistic view. It can't be just me or any other architect that says, we like public spaces. It needs to be a bunch of people. It needs to be people that are in politics, people that are residents of the city, people that are architects, that really have a common goal. I think it's only then when everyone kind of has a common interest that anything really can be done, because there's too much kind of private agendas that happen today. So it's hard for any one group of people to really make a big difference. Yeah, that's exactly my issues with the space as well. I mean, even that big, ugly curving building it's even curving the wrong way. It's like pushing people away to get away. But I'm not sure. It's really complicated, and I guess I don't really know the details of how we would go about that yet. I mean, if I continue studying this, I hope that something might be done in the future. sorry, I can't really answer it completely because I don't know all the political, stuff that happens in laws.
Anyone else? One up there.
Thank you. I came into your lecture a little bit late, but years ago in Boston there was an organization set up called the Government Center Task Force, and this was back in the early '90s, and it was a mixture of architects and people who work for the city and just residents who met for I believe like a year or a year and a half and had like monthly meetings and stuff, and came up with recommendations as to what the city could do with Government Center to make it better. I totally agree with you about the bleakness and how it's just underutilized. The city did nothing with that. Also, during the past 2 years, City Council has had several hearings public hearings at City Council regarding moving City Hall to
South End, yeah,
the
South Boston, yeah, waterfront. Yeah.
Basically, the mayor's old idea is to move City Hall to where the Bank of America Pavilion is. There's a lot of people, including myself, against that.
Mm-hmm.
My suggestion personally was to take the existing government center, build a new city hall in an L shape, take up all that brick area, put the head house of the government center, destroy the old city hall that's there now, and use that as a public area for concerts and stuff. And that area is actually facing Quincy Market. So I don't think it's our fault, members of the community and stuff. We've expressed our opinions.
Yeah.
The city's not doing anything
Yeah.
about it. Would you like to comment on that?
No, I agree with everything you said, except for tearing down City Hall. We can't tear it down. I mean, I thought I went to one of those meetings right before I left. Actually, they were just kind of getting underway when I left, and I thought it was the most interesting thing that I took from it was they had, I don't know, something like 25 people that actually spoke publicly, and there were, of course, the 1 or 2 people that just hated City Hall and said tear it down and build a new one down the waterfront. But a majority of the people said keep it there. It was very important to keep City Hall. And what I thought was even more interesting was the people that said that must stay there actually hated the building. They said publicly, I hate the building, but it is important, it needs to stay. And I think that the building gets a bad rap because of everything around it. I think, granted, yeah, if you look back to the master plan, it's probably placed in the wrong area. But what if we were to leave City Hall and tear down the other buildings and really project out to the West End, which is really a lost opportunity? It's a very central part of the city that's all but lost in the West End. I think that you need to keep City Hall. It's an important piece of architectural history. It's an image of the city. It's a very important piece of architecture. It's probably one of the more important city halls in the past 100 years, arguably. I think that everything around it can change, and there are ways to keep the building and reintegrate Quincy Market, as well as new areas like the West End and North End.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. This is the last in our series. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you.